Wow. My intros really are either 5 seconds or 3 minutes. There's just no in between, is there? Wahoo! Look at that! Miquella! The one demigod out there we haven't faced yet. Probably the single most cryptic entity in the entire lore of the game. I wonder what else this DLC could have possibly been about. I mean, to be honest, they did have like 20 different options. Well, anyways, FromSoft DLCs have a tradition of always packing in more details than what appears to be on the surface. And the single layer bean burrito they're giving you ends up being a 7-layer meat and cheese fest that can feed a family of 3. More like family of me. Let's dig into this bit. Miquella hasn't exactly been confirmed as the integral part of the DLC, but by looking at the rider of the spectral steed unveiled in the teaser, an extremely young person with golden hair and braids, everything seems to fall pretty well in line with the idea that this is indeed Miquella we're looking at here. And a character like Miquella, one of the only shard bearers we've yet to meet face to face, is not someone that would be introduced into the story as an appetizer or an afterthought. Undoubtedly, this is the central story of the DLC, but analyzing the main quest is almost never the fun part. Details are still extremely sparse on basically everything else the DLC consists of, including other potential characters, great rune shards, and areas we'll potentially be exploring. One name remains on the table, which is Godwyn. After defeating Commander Nile up in the precipice of Castle Sol, we get access to an NPC with a rather mysterious few lines of dialogue. The sun has not been swallowed. Our prayers were lacking. Your comrade remains soulless. Of course, the only name we've ever heard of in the entirety of Elden Ring who fits the description of soulless while being powerful enough to be Miquella's ally would, of course, be the illustrious Godwyn the Golden, otherwise known as the Prince of Death. Meeting an untimely end at the hands of the Black Knives during the night of the dire plot, this death was what plunged the state of the Lands Between straight into the toilet, single-handedly catalyzing the shattering. In this regard, this makes Godwyn one of the most critical characters to everything we've experienced in Elden Ring, despite getting very little to almost no screen time. We know that he defeated and befriended a Lich Dragon, and we know that he's so strong that others felt the only way he could be erased from the picture was by catching him asleep and literally assassinating him with the power of the Rune of Death. This guy was not someone you just fucked around with. Radahn, for instance, is referred to as the most powerful demigod of the Shattering, but this really only means he's the most powerful demigod that simply remained alive during the war. This communicates Radahn's power pretty well, as he certainly feels like the mightiest we've fought so far, but if we're only limiting our scope to demigods who are currently alive in the story of the base game, that leaves Godwyn completely out of the picture. And I think that's on purpose. This leads me to believe the strength Godwyn would have commanded in his prime was so out of everyone else's league that comparing his power to any single demigod except Miquella would have just been a disservice. If Miquella is to be a main segment of the DLC's plot, then it's hard not to imagine that Godwyn will play an equally huge part. Even the Erdtree in the tweeted picture seems to have some sort of root growing around it, and a few people have already pointed out that this is very likely to be Godwyn's death root. This is one of those things where you could argue pretty much any avenue you wanted, and just because of how little information there is out there, no one can really tell you your interpretation is wrong. Are we looking at the Erdtree in its infantile stages, and maybe we're watching the tree grow? Or maybe this is an alternate reality where the Erdtree is being destroyed and never really had the chance to grow to the proportion we know it as. You could argue literally anything, but the one crux of the plot seems to, at the very least, be involved with the backstories of Miquella and Godwyn. So, instead of trying to extrapolate what the entire plot might just be from one photo, because that sounds like way too much work, I also want to focus on what this means for us, the players of this game, gameplay-wise, and what we can potentially be looking forward to. I personally think FromSoft will use this expansion as a means to give Death Sorceries and Incantations the love that they deserved in the first place. It's no controversial statement that, with the exception of maybe one or two, death spells in the game have long been missing out on a lot of incentives and details that make other Magic schools so fun to play. Deathblight is only ever useful in PvP as a status ailment, and even then the efficiency of it isn't spectacular, and the community's general opinion towards Deathblight and death spells are usually very mixed. I think FromSoft will use the subject matter of this DLC to really drive home just how powerful having a command over death actually was meant to be in the game, and I think they're going to do that not just by communicating how powerful Godwyn was in his prime, but also by giving the Tarnished access to extremely powerful death sorceries and incantations that we could never imagine. I remember falling in love with Malekith's Black Blade when I first used it, and that edgy anime blade spiral looking weapon skill just never gets old to me, no matter how much I use it. I'd really love to see what death-related items they have in mind that will communicate the strength of Godwyn, much like how the Star Scourge greatswords communicate the strength of Radahn, or how the Hand of Millennia turns you into a nuclear-powered blender. Additionally, FromSoft has made it very evident in the past that they pay attention to absolutely every bit of feedback given by their community. They listened to us when we said Waves of Darkness needed to be fixed, they listened to us when we said poise on colossal weapons felt too strong in PvP, and in that regard, they listened to a lot of our concerns about PvP in general. And no matter how imbalanced it still feels on one side, there's no denying that they've put in the effort where it counts, and PvP is considerably more enjoyable across the board than it used to be. The reason I bring this up is because the community has been very vocal about one of the biggest sources of excitement that comes from these games, which are the boss encounters. Bloodborne was my first FromSoft game, and moreover, The Old Hunters was my first experience playing a FromSoft DLC. I distinctly remember what it was like walking into Ludwig's boss arena, experiencing and eventually fighting through his second phase, and just thinking, wow, you guys were holding this shit back the whole time? That might be because whereas the main game usually has a strict deadline attached to it, these sorts of content expansions have always been labors of love, and they end up being some of the most memorable parts of the whole game as a result. Ludwig, Gale, and Black Flame Frida are some of my all-time favorite boss fights in FromSoft's recent history, and I don't think it's a coincidence that all of those fights happen to be DLC encounters. I'd say the same for Sekiro, but I mean, let's be honest, topping Ishin is not an easy bar to surpass. I wouldn't be disappointed in the slightest seeing Miquella posing as the final boss of the DLC, but I don't think it would hurt to give someone of Godwyn status his own fight as well. Who knows, with how closely knit these two characters are, this may even be a huge opportunity FromSoft has to make us eat our words regarding the opinion of duo fights. We do know that Miquella is cursed to an eternal youth after all, so maybe we'll find a unique duo fight where an incredibly weakened but still extremely powerful Miquella is just like hanging off of Godwyn's back Lothric style. I'm obviously just spitballing ideas here at this point, but at the end of the day, I'm just excited we get to fight more bosses like this. Just about all of FromSoft's ball breaker bosses, so to speak, usually come from these kinds of expansions. There's a fair share of content that was cut out from the final game that could give us plenty of pointers as to what exactly the DLC contains. Miquella and Godwyn are pretty much a sure bet at this point, if all the assumptions are true, but these expansions usually don't have just one focal point, and with Elden Ring being as open as it is, I have a hard time imagining the relationship between Miquella and Godwyn is the only point they would focus on. For instance, there's an entire cut questline regarding Saint Trina that never even made it into the base game, and there's already plenty of speculation out there detailing the deep rabbit hole that all point to Miquella and Saint Trina being one and the same. The way Saint Trina is described, from item descriptions on cookbooks to the way Saint Trina is referred to by others in dialogue interactions, Miquella and Saint Trina are two names that seem to overlap on multiple fronts. Saint Trina having both feminine and masculine depictions lends itself perfectly to Miquella's androgynous appearance. This is of course only if we consider this cut content to still be canonical despite having no presence in the game. I have no idea what could have changed about the quest from here to now, but most of the overarching details I'd imagine would remain the same. Despite being cut, this was a pretty fleshed out quest line that very purposefully made lots of connections to Miquella and Saint Trina. I don't think they would just retcon something like that for no reason. After all, messing around with double personalities is not uncharted territory for Elden Ring, Radagon and Marika being the prime example. Perhaps Saint Trina could be an alter ego of Miquella's, or just nothing more than an alias given to him by others who followed him. I'm not looking to venture too deep into the rabbit hole, I'm simply suggesting that you can't really tell a full story about Miquella without giving attention to this mysterious second identity. And if that's what this expansion is aiming to do, then I would say this quest involving Saint Trina is gonna have to show itself in full splendor. And that's not even touching on plenty of other actions out there that were cut from the game. One of the most important being an NPC who goes by the name of Rico, this guy, who in his dialogue literally called Saint Trina by the name Miquella. So if this cut content is to be taken as canon, then there's pretty much no mistaking it. There are plenty of videos out there that all explain such cut content better than I have just now, so I'll be linking a few below to sate your curiosities in case that giant rabbit hole of information is just too deep for you to ignore. What could be more exciting than putting your foes to sleep? Well, a lot of things, actually. Having a sleep ailment in any game is extremely tough to nail down and make fun, and it's no huge statement or anything that Elden Ring really seemed to struggle with that. There are only 2 sleep enemies in the entire game, and they're both crabs for some reason. Additionally, there are only 2 weapons in the game that involve sleep attributes, which is a sword and a torch. So yeah, to say sleep is absent in the game would be an understatement at best. I'm not gonna jump the gun and say they intentionally withheld some of their better ideas specifically for when they knew they were gonna start working on an expansion. I'm just saying if that's what they did, I totally get it, I understand. Taking what we know about how the base game legacy dungeons are formatted, combined with the fact that Miquella had a secret Second Life account this whole time, the absence of a sleep-themed legacy dungeon in the game suddenly makes perfect sense. I'll be honest, the whole idea of sleep, or at least in terms of giving the player ways to inflict sleep onto enemies, sounds pretty boring. I can't really explain why, but I guess the simplest explanation I can offer personally is that it just doesn't sound very proactive. The sleep status ailment seems more fit for infiltration and stealth than it does raw combat, and that's just not for me personally. It is worth noting, however, that the item description of the Bewitching Branch says it was blessed with an incantation of unalloyed gold, and this is when we start to realize Miquella's influence was capable of far more than just putting people to sleep. Whatever incantation this item is referring to, we might end up seeing and using somewhere in the expansion. Maybe they're trying to find a way to bring rapport back, I don't know. What I'm more interested in though is how these mechanics will be used against the player, aside from just breathing on us and putting us to sleep for 5 seconds. If Miquella's power extends beyond that of just allowing people to take naps, then we could be looking at some serious reality distortions. Allies suddenly turning against us in the same way we would use the Bewitching Branch for us. I'm not exactly sure how they would even apply this sort of power, but if we do end up fighting Miquella at the end of the expansion, I can't wait to pull out a spirit summon only for Miquella to pull some brainjack shit and straight up just start attacking me with my own summon. If that actually happened, I think I'd shit my pants. Shit would fly out of my ass and through my gamer chair at terminal velocity. This is, first and foremost, what we're assuming to be a Miquella-centric expansion. It kind of has to be if everything else is true. So any mention of Malenia will probably just be lip service. I expect to learn more about Miquella's relationship with his twin sister, but I don't expect Malenia to be a huge name we'll hear too often. The role of Rot in the expansion probably isn't that significant, but I have reason to believe this is another status ailment of sorts that will likely be expanded upon. In terms of weaponry, the most obvious of them all are the mysterious twin blades Abundance and Decay. Miquella's twin blade contained the power of the Rune of Abundance, whereas the twin blade of Abundance and Decay symbolized a unity between the twin Empyreans, Miquella and Malenia, and contained the power of 2 different runes, being Abundance and Decay. Obtaining these twin blades is something I wouldn't even begin to parse together, since there are so many different avenues the game could go with it. They could be boss weapons, or they could just be discarded in a cave centuries ago. Maybe we'll find another misbegotten somewhere, hanging out in the dungeon just using it to cut salami or something. But if these twin blades are to return in the expansion, specifically the Abundance and Decay twin blade, that would be quite the weapon. I don't think there's another weapon in the game that contains the power of not only 2 different runes, but 2 runes that seem to conflict in their very nature. The Rune of Abundance suggests a guiding light that cures afflictions and allows all to flourish, which falls perfectly in line with Miquella's ideas. The Rune of Decay, however, suggests, well, decay. This implies that this is a weapon that deals holy damage and rot buildup, which, my god, what a combo. I'm not kidding, that sounds legitimately amazing if everything checks out. Scarlet rot builds are already on the underrated side in my opinion, and I find that not a lot of people tend to favor them just because ew stinky poison build, so this might be a gateway weapon or something, I don't know. I'm looking forward to what they do with Rot incantations because the Servant of Rot spells, as they are now, don't give us much to play around with. And there are only 3 incantations in the game right now that have anything to do with Scarlet Rot, which are Rotten Breath, Exike's Decay, and Scarlet Aeonia, all of which are very okay. Regardless, I don't think it's a huge coincidence that the 3 subtypes of magic that seem to be the most starving are also the most likely to be expanded upon in the DLC, which are Death, Sleep, and Rot. Everyone is already attached to the idea that Miquella's cocoon in Mohg's Dynasty area will provide the access point for the DLC. That's an idea that I love in theory, but considering how far deep into the endgame you find the Dynasty area, I'm not sure if that's the most practical point of access. Mohgwyn's palace has scaling very similar to the Erdtree, which is about as endgame as you can get. The only other expansion that would have held off until this far into the game would be the Ringed City in Dark Souls 3, and that expansion had a very distinct tone of finality to it. Like you knew the story was over with when you completed it. I'm not sure if that's what they're doing with Shadow of the Erdtree, because although it looks like it's offering plenty of depth for Miquella's story, there are still way too many loose ends in Elden Ring for that to be the only story they plan on telling. I'd look for the point of access to be somewhere mid to late game, but not quite at the very end, so the progression makes a bit more sense. And a few of you might already know exactly where I'm going with this. There's a statue in the Altus Plateau that I think would be a perfect candidate, specifically the one near the Altus Highway Junction, Grace. The place where you find the Amber Starlight? Yeah, that place. This is another location involving a cut questline that apparently divulged a few details about Miquella. The statue is a little dark, but if you go there at noon and make sure it's brightened up a bit, you can very easily make out the shape of a woman with a single arm, and what looks like a younger boy accompanying her. Inferring that the woman is in fact Malenia, it's very easy to also assume the younger boy at her side is Miquella. And that's not even the biggest sell for me. This area on the map actually has a marker for an unused location. The name of that location is St. Trina's Hideaway. So there's almost no question at this point. This either validates that Miquella and St. Trina have always been the same person, or at the very least, the game is intent on heading in that direction. It's a pretty likely candidate, though I think there's a second possibility that people have mostly forgotten about. Miquella had more titles out there than a fucking title generator, whatever, I'm tired. Miquella of the Eclipse, Miquella the Unalloyed, the Fundamentalist, he's also St. Trina, but there's usually one identity people tend to skip over, which is Lord of the Eclipse. Do you remember those weird ghostly NPCs populating Castle Sol up in the mountaintop? Have you ever wondered what they're, like, doing there? Here, how about I give you a few hints? There are some Eclipse-themed items you can get throughout the game, being the Eclipse Crest Heater Shield and Great Shield, and the Eclipse Shotel. Both of the shields have something in their item descriptions involving soulless demigods, and that the Eclipse offered them slumber in addition to protecting them from destined death. The Eclipse is the symbol of the Wandering Mausoleums, and it's suggested that these mausoleums were meant to be a sort of burial place for these demigods. So whatever this Eclipse is, the people of Castle Sol obviously found it very important, because in the area where you find the Eclipse Shotel, you can see one of these ghost NPCs literally praying to it. Surrender yourself to the Eclipse. Grant life to soulless bones. And when you take into account the Eclipse's power to even contend with destined death somehow, it suddenly becomes very evident here that these figures, along with Miquella, were trying to restore someone's soul. Now, how exactly could we figure out whose soul it was that they were trying to restore? It's Godwyn. It's Godwyn. He's literally the only demigod that fits any of what I just said. I actually think this could be just as likely a point of access as the other two I mentioned, since Miquella has a lot of history here. Maybe the ghost NPC that gives you the left half of the Erdtree medallion will be replaced with something, maybe another invisible bridge, or maybe something to do with that wandering mausoleum outside. Look, if any of that sounds far-fetched, just remember there's a FromSoft game out there that requires you to get grabbed and almost killed by a giant space almond just to access an expansion. I have no idea what they could possibly end up deciding on, but I feel like this is their opportunity to have a little fun, and the cocoon in Mohgwyn's palace just seems like way too obvious an answer. In conclusion, I'm gonna spend days of my life playing this. That's my conclusion. Yeah, I don't have anything else for the outro today, so, you're free to go, I guess.